to my left is Katelyn Roedner Sutter. She's a California director for the Environmental Defense Fund. And then we're joined by Michael Jared, who's a principal and founder of Regenerative Strategies Consulting, and Aimee Delach, who's a senior policy analyst for Defenders of Wildlife. Virtually, we have Peter Lehner, who's a managing attorney of sustainable food and farming at Earthjustice. So as a reminder, you're joining us whether in person or virtually, we'd like to have your questions on Slido, and also to be using the hashtag foodandag24. So Peter, we're going to go ahead and start with you because you're virtual, and then we'll go with the rest of our panel and open it up to everybody for questions. Earthjustice, if you're not familiar, was the Sierra Club legal defense club until 1997, I believe. And so, Peter, let's talk with you about how your organization currently works to lobby on food and ag issues, and what kind of common ground you might have with some of the ag organizations and food companies. Okay. Peter, is this better now to be able to hear me? I just saw your text that you were having a little trouble hearing. So perhaps can you turn your sound up? We can see you just fine. Any better? Well,
are you?
We can hear you. Can you say? Well, if you start speaking, maybe we can hear you. Tell you what.
Well, I'm sorry. It's a little hard for me to hear you. Can you hear me relatively well?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Since I know what you were going to ask, I'm just going to jump in and answer the question, which is explain a little bit about Earthjustice and why I'm doing this. So I'm the managing attorney of our Sustainable Food and Farming program. I hope everyone knows what Earthjustice is, but just in case not, we're a national environmental law organization about 55 years old, based in California, although a national organization now. I also teach food system and environmental law at Columbia and Yale law schools, but I came to this work focusing on agriculture after about 30 years of working on broader environmental issues. And so I often use that experience to compare how we deal with agriculture to how we think about, say, the energy transition that we're all talking about. And I think that can provide some helpful insights into environmental law and larger policy issues. We're focusing a lot on helping the transition to clean fuel, clean food and agriculture. Very much like you'll hear environmental colleagues talking about the transition to clean energy. And so part of that is focusing on the climate impact of agriculture. Everybody knows that climate change is driven by fossil fuels, and burning them releases CO2. But outside of this room, a lot of people have no clue how agriculture contributes to climate change. The methane from cows and manure and rice, the nitrous oxide from fields and manure, the carbon dioxide from land conversion and land use, and of course, a little bit of fossil fuel burning and carbon dioxide. So all of us have a big job just educating the public about agriculture and climate change. And also, of course, agriculture is on the front lines of dealing with climate change because it's much more weather dependent than many other sectors of the economy. So one aspect of our work is just general education as much as we can. And so thank you so much for having me here. Another part is policy. That's a lot at the federal level, and that's Congress often. We've had great progress with the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm sure everybody here knows, allocated about $20 billion to support farmers using climate-friendly conservation practices. The big question now is whether that momentum will be maintained in the Farm Bill that is coming up, as the Senate version would, but as the House version would not. So that's a big policy question coming up. we obviously would like to keep that climate focus and the climate and the support for climate-friendly conservation practices in the next Farm Bill. Another area has been administrative advocacy. For example, the Renewable Fuel Standard. On behalf of National Wildlife Federation, we sued EPA over that, and many of you are probably familiar with it, but may not know that it's a big driver of cost. EPA acknowledges it would cost consumers about $28 billion a year, and their own model comparison shows it has little to no climate benefit. So we should really be asking ourselves whether using 60 million acres of our prime farmland for biofuels is the most sensible use of that. And then the last area that I'll quickly touch on is sort of the conventional pollution that accompanies climate pollution, air and water pollution. And one of the biggest sources of that we're working on are concentrated animal feeding operations, which everyone here knows about, CAFOs. Among others, we petitioned EPA to address water pollution, and they've established a federal advisory committee that just met for the first time last week. And I think that is going to be an important step forward over the next couple of years, how EPA deals with water pollution from CAFOs. So I'll stop there as some of the highlights of what we're doing, and hopefully that was helpful.
Yes, that's very helpful to understand what you're working on, and hopefully we'll continue to be able to improve your audio on our end so that so we can keep you connected here. Katelyn, I'd like to move on over to Environmental Defense Fund because we've worked with a lot of your crew in the past on different things, and I know you're very engaged in California on issues related to groundwater and to Sigma. So share with us more about how EDF is working in the state.
Yeah, absolutely. And also thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's really great to be with you. My role is a lot of government affairs, and so sometimes I get to go deep on issues I don't necessarily talk about every day. And this is one of them. So this is really fun to be here, and I appreciate it. EDF as an organization really values partnerships, and I mean that is a model that we use in a lot of our work, whether it's partnering with major corporations, partnering with frontline communities, and certainly partnering with the agriculture community. And we see this really as a necessary strategy to ensure that agriculture continues to thrive, communities are healthy, and we have restored ecosystems, not only in California, but across the country long into the future. So that means we work with growers, we work with the dairy industry, we work with food and ag companies, policymakers, and of course, local rural communities. And that's essential, I mean, because that's essential to mitigating some of that climate pollution that we were just hearing about. It's essential for improving soil carbon sequestration. But it's also growers that are on the front lines of the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing. One of my colleagues who helped me prepare for this has a family farm in Texas, and they just lost their entire cotton crop because of all of the storms. And I'm not going to get into the attribution science, but he and his family, along with many of you, are on the front lines. So in order to facilitate these partnerships, we really draw on EDF's decades of successful work to help understand the emerging needs and priorities of the ag community. We then work with scientists and lawmakers, tech and engineering firms to help build out tools to address those needs and priorities. And then we test them on the ground with our partners. So 2 examples for you. We worked with NASA and Google and literally hundreds of ag stakeholders to build out something called OpenET, which is a digital platform that uses satellite data to provide low-cost, near real-time, field-level data on water consumption. There's a lot of adjectives to get in there, but the idea is making it easy for growers to see as close to possible as real-time what their water consumption really is. And alongside that, we've developed the groundwater accounting platform, which is basically a water checking account, so you could see the credits and debits, again, in pretty close to real time. And we worked with a lot of partners in the ag sector on that, including the California Farm Bureau, irrigation districts, water agencies, to create these tools that help farmers better optimize their water consumption. And that's been a huge focus of our work in California. I guess just sort of broadly, I will say that I think EDF is at its best when we are supporting these sort of big ideas with research, with our advocacy work, and designing policies that are designed in collaboration with local communities, with growers, and with their needs and needs of ecosystems in mind. So I'll stop there for now, but that's sort of big picture of how we think about working with the food and ag community.
Good. Well, I know we can drill down into a little bit more specifics and some examples, but thank you for that. Michael, tell us just a little bit about how you started on the policy front, and then you founded your own business, and you're actually working with some farm organizations and environmental right now.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invite and opportunity to come address this conference. We're happy to be here. Yeah, that's correct. So I started in policy as a California Senate fellow and a long time ago. I'm not going to give the year. And I worked for a senator and then for the Senate Office of Research, and I always did environmental, energy, natural resources policy. And then I moved to the Assembly and was there for about 7 years as a consultant for the Assembly Natural Resources Committee. And part of my jurisdiction dealt with fire prevention, forestry, and agricultural issues. A lot of times we would get bills referred to us in addition to Assembly Agriculture. And I found a real passion for the issue. I also personally have found a passion growing things for most of my life. And during the pandemic, I made some rash decisions, as I'm sure a lot of other people did. And I sold my nice suburban home in Southland Park and moved to West Sacramento on an acre with a well and a septic and a barn, and started growing a bunch of things. In fact, this morning I was putting ointment in my duck's eye and shading my tomatoes. And in addition, I quit the legislature, which I'd been working at for like 15 years, and started my own business, which I have several clients, but they sort of run the gambit. I have the Community Alliance with Family Farmers, which has been around for 45 years and has 8,000 members in California. They often find themselves in the middle of bigger agricultural organizations' advocacy and environmental advocacy, and they try to bridge the divide. In addition, I represent the California Institute for Biodiversity, which are very concerned about the sort of biodiversity collapse that's occurring in our world. And they take a very scientific approach, including we don't even know all the species that exist right now, and so we need to do some science work identifying and cataloging all the species that are on this planet right now to better understand biodiversity so that we can manage and protect it. In addition, I have some subcontracted clients, including Next Gen California, which works a lot on school nutrition and food insecurity work. And one of the things I've been fortunate to work with them is on the California Nutrition Incentive Program, which is a great program that's supported by the federal farm bill, the GusNIP program, which matches, it basically provides a match for people when they go to farmers markets and really deals with food prices and helps people who are food insecure take advantage of buying produce directly from farmers, developing a relationship with farmers, and lowering their price of food and improving their choices on food. The governor's budget proposed to eliminate the state funding for that program, and we've worked really hard, and we're able to restore it in the legislative budget. And what I've been hearing from a lot of people is that on all the local farmers markets in Sacramento, the line for that market match is increasing every farmers market. And so it's a really important thing to really help connect the community. And that's, I think, where I try to find myself is find places of common ground where we can help the environment, help small family farmers as well. So thank you.
Well, it sure sounds like you've been busy since you started your own business and your own farm out there. So Aimee, tell us a little bit about Defenders of Wildlife and your work.
Sure. Hi, I'm Aimee Delach with Defenders of Wildlife. We are a conservation organization focused on mostly on United States biodiversity. So we look at law, policy, legal, funding, voluntary conservation solutions to protect our most endangered species and also to keep species from becoming endangered, to keep species from declining. I have worked with defenders for pretty much my whole career, and over that period of time, I have done some work on Farm Bill policy, almost 25 years ago now. And I've also worked on renewable energy, the Smart from the Start siting and operation of renewable energy, and I'm currently our lead on climate change adaptation. Defenders is also well known prominently for our work on coexistence. We help fund producers in particular to implement practices that keep wildlife and people and agricultural production from interfering with each other. So we put up funding for electric fences around beehives in bear country. We fund practices that help keep wolves away from livestock, and also even things like in Alaska, food lockers to keep polar bears away from native communities there. So we do a lot of different types of work. When we talk about common ground, I think some of the most important common ground that I hope we can all agree on is that we are in a biodiversity crisis. We have seen 47% loss in ecosystem condition over recent decades, and over the next few decades, we could lose up to a quarter of known life on Earth, up to 1 million species. We are also in a climate crisis that is intertwined with, it's one of the causes of the biodiversity crisis, along with habitat loss, pollution, invasive species, and overexploitation. And we know that both of these crises have tremendous implications for agriculture, whether you're talking about temperature, whether you're talking about water, whether you're talking about pollinators. We can talk a little bit more in detail about those as we go forward today.
Yeah, thank you. And I see we started to get one question in. Please submit any others that you have. One of the things I challenged the panel on, and I want to make sure my staff has assured me Peter can hear everything you said now, but we should bring him back in on at least the screen here, and there we go. So Peter, if you can hear me now, can you nod your head or give me a thumbs up? I'm not seeing Peter agree with what we are thinking here on the ground, but I'll call on him in just a minute. But one of the things I challenged the panel to think about is, in a world where we have so many different organizations in California representing food and ag and agribusiness, what are some ways that we might be able to reach out and find some common areas of agreement, if at all? And I realize that sometimes that's not practical, but sometimes it just is because there's not even conversations happening. Katelyn, can you kick us off a little bit about how you do? You talked about some of your engagement, but how do you reach out with some of the new players and start to build those relationships and perhaps find some common ground?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess there's sort of two initiatives that I think illustrate how we do this. And both are really focused on sort of that partnership model, like I talked about at the top, like, making sure that we are working with not only growers, but also local communities to address both the challenges they're facing, the challenge, we see the climate and ecosystems facing, and what growers and farmers are dealing with. So one of those initiatives is called the Multi-Benefit Land Repurposing Program, which just rolls right off the tongue, but MLRP for short. And this is sort of built out of the idea that California has shrinking groundwater supplies. There are rules in place under SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And as a result, there is a not insignificant amount of land, specifically in San Joaquin Valley, that will likely have to come out of production. But if that is not done in a strategic way and in partnership with all the stakeholders, we could very well just sort of wind up with a dusty patchwork that is going to make air quality issues worse and flood issues worse and not provide economic benefits to anybody. So the idea is by growers, communities, groundwater sustainability agencies, and groups like Environmental Defense Fund working together to develop a plan to transition some farmland to other beneficial uses that reduces demand for groundwater. And of course, funding comes along with it. As a plug, that's why we need a climate bond, so we have some more funding for programs like this. It's been really successful. There's been 2 rounds of funding, and in both cases, completely oversubscribed by hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's a lot of interest in programs like this where there's sort of this multi-stakeholder effort to identify, we could do low impact solar here, we could have a park here, we can do some habitat restoration here. And so it's a multi-benefit program. And that's really been something that EDF has led the charge on alongside many, many partners. And now we serve with a local organization in San Joaquin Valley, Self-Help Enterprises, as the statewide support entity to help implement this program. And I guess really quickly, I want to zoom out from California and talk about an initiative that is brand new within the last 6 months. We launched it at COP28 back in December. And that is the Dairy Methane Action Alliance. And we launched it with companies like Danone, Nestle, General Mills, and we have since added Clover Sonoma and Starbucks. We have 8 members right now. But the idea is EDF works with these companies. We work together in an alliance to identify methane emissions, disclose methane emissions, and most importantly, commit to an action plan to reducing those methane emissions. So this is all about accelerating action, accelerating research and innovation, and also getting the eyes of investors on potential solutions to address methane emissions. So that's really exciting. We are still in the early phase of this journey, but has been really rewarding to see the immense interest already that there is a desire to tackle methane emissions. So those are 2 initiatives that I think illustrate sort of how we like to work with the food and ag industry as well as local communities.
Okay, thank you. And I understand from my text going back and forth that Peter can hear now. But Michael, we're going to let you go ahead while I reiterate the question about what are some of those areas of engagement with the farm community and the food community to help find common ground. But Michael and Aimee, I'll let you go ahead and ask, and then we'll let Peter jump back in.
Sure, thank you. I think there's several ways, and I noticed on one of the slides it talks about clean energy policy, and I think that farmers have a lot to offer in terms of generation of clean energy policy. I think that dual-use solar agrivoltaics is a really promising field where just today I was shading my tomatoes, and I think more and more farmers are having to deal with shading both for livestock and for crops. And then could solar be an option to provide shading, but then also to provide generation for electricity, for clean electricity? So I think that's one option that there could be common ground. Another really promising option, I believe, is prescribed grazing. There's a lot of opportunities to reduce California's fire risk through prescribed grazing, and it can be done in a way with light touch grazing where it also supports biodiversity by targeting invasive plants, grasses and stuff like that. So I think there are places of common ground. In addition, protection of agricultural land. I think that California has long viewed the protection of agricultural land as an important climate strategy for reducing emissions from lands. So those are just 3 different areas of common ground, I think.
All right, thanks. Aimee?
I would definitely reiterate the opportunities with respect to clean energy. We know that we need probably about 10 million acres to find enough room for solar, and that does not have to be a major constraint. There are a lot of lands that we can use, and there are a lot of opportunities that those can be supplementary income for producers rather than displacing prime agricultural lands. There are opportunities for using those more marginal lands. There are opportunities for, again, agrivoltaics, and there's one study in France where they actually put solar panels over top of grape orchards and found that those orchards managed, the vineyards managed much better under drought stress because they were shaded somewhat. There are opportunities, tremendous opportunities across the landscape for wind, and we know that the footprint of wind each turbine is quite small and is quite compatible with agriculture in a lot of cases. And we know that there's a lot that goes into siting of renewable energy, including transmission and resource potential and the local land use restrictions. And I think that there are a lot of opportunities there. And then the other place that I would find common ground, I think, is on protection and creation of habitat. There's a lot of opportunities, particularly under the Farm Bill programs, conservation security program, and the EQIP program for creating and improving habitat. Again, for pollinators, that's tremendously important, which 1/3 of our calories comes from animal pollinated species, and I think if we found that we were losing our pollinators at the rate that they are, say, in Sichuan, China, where they have to, hand pollinate their apples and pear orchards there, we would be very, very in very much a farm labor crisis if we were to find that happening here.
So just one quick follow-up, because after we had talked about this originally in a prep call, the Los Angeles Times came out with a big article about a huge solar farm that was going to interfere with habitat for desert tortoise. And so talk just a little bit about how do you balance also defending wildlife when you're in solar energy development?
Sure. Desert tortoise is one of the species of great concern within the desert Southwest. It is very rare, but also very widespread, which does make it a bit of a challenge for siting of renewable energy. Again, there are, many, many acres that are already disturbed, particularly on Bureau of Land Management lands, but also somewhat on private lands in the California desert, where we don't necessarily have those conflicts because they are no longer good desert habitat for the tortoise. There are also areas where the slope is a little bit higher. Desert tortoises prefer the more flat areas. Those higher slope areas used to be considered not to be great for solar, but the technology has changed so much that now a lot of those areas are now viable for solar. So we can do it. We just have to do it carefully.
Right. Peter, I'm so glad you can hear us better now. Sorry about the tech. Same question for you in terms of finding these areas where there can be some areas of agreement with the ag and food communities.
Sure, thank you for asking. We've been working with farmers a lot in our federal advocacy. I mentioned earlier the Farm Bill programs, the Farm Bill conservation programs that probably everybody's familiar with, EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, Conservation Stewardship Program, et cetera. Now, 2 out of 3 farmers that apply for these programs are turned away. Farmers like these programs, and it turns out that a lot of the practices they apply for are practices that help reduce the climate impact of their operations, that are climate-friendly practices. And so these are the very practices that the Inflation Reduction Act would gives an extra $20 billion for, these climate-friendly Farm Bill conservation programs. So we've twice helped fly in a bunch of farmers down into Washington. And one of them, by the way, was from Texas and had some solar panels over his vegetables because it both produced electricity and needed some shade when it starts getting 110 degrees. But so they come and visit a lot of Hill offices to say that these conservation programs are really terrific for the farmer, and we need more of them, not less of them. So that's been a really helpful opportunity. We've also done the same thing at the state level. In California and in about, last I heard, is about 16 or 18 other states have state healthy soil laws, which are relatively new programs to, again, support farmers adopting these climate-friendly conservation practices that will help help them use and develop healthier soils. And it's very helpful and very important that the lawmakers hear from farmers to say, hey, we really want this. It's not just those environmental advocates, it's we the farmers want these programs. So we've worked together to get those laws passed in some states, and you often have to first get the law passed and then try to get it funded and then get it implemented. So it's a lot of work, but it does mean more support for farmers who are leading the way in transitioning to using more climate-friendly practices.
I'm going to turn over to Michael for this next question. It's the top one here on our screen because I know you do work with some smaller farm operations and representatives. Do you hear from them also about concerns about paperwork and environmental regulations? And I mean, is that a concern about increasing their costs and their management burdens? And if so, how do you balance some of that?
That's a great question. Yes, we do hear about fees. You know, small farmers operate on very small margins, and so any additional cost can tip them over into not being viable anymore. And we lose, I believe, 4 family farms every day in California. So it is a real issue. I've heard it specifically with the water boards. Some of their fees for like stock ponds and things like that have been deemed excessive. And I think, you know, for farmers, if they see a value in the service being provided, I think it's important for government to really show, like, well, the reason we're charging this amount is we're doing this, and it does this. But oftentimes that communication isn't given in the best way. And another way in which sort of regulations cause some burdens to small family farmers is timing. Sometimes there'll be like requests or orders from the water board to reduce usage of water, but it'll be timed to after planting season. And it's always good to give people notice and to let them know what they could potentially expect so they can make decisions before they've already made those decisions. So I think that there is a way to find, I think government's having to deal with this all over the place because of inflation. All consumers and people are feeling the burden of higher costs. So we just have to find ways to be more efficient and to get at the same goals with less work, thus less fees.
I'll throw this out for the entire panel to see who would like to grab it. But one of our questions, actually a couple of them that have popped up here, have to do with the incentives for small versus large farmers. As many of you know, there are limits on payments that can be made under federal Farm Bill programs, and oftentimes there's a strong dialogue around the ability to target towards the smallest farmers who are most in need. But when it comes to something like climate, should we be having cutoffs by size?
I think we definitely should. You know, there's finite resources that are available. You know, if there was an unlimited pot of funding, then no, we shouldn't have those limits. But if, you know, a small family farm that, you know, is not going to be viable without support applies and all the money is gone, then, you know, I think that causes significant problems. So, you know, as long as it's finite sums of funds, we should be focusing those funds on the people who need it the most. And so that usually is the smaller farmer that operates on a much smaller margin.
And I would add that I think we should be focusing those funds on the practices and projects that have the most benefit from our perspective for both climate and for wildlife and biodiversity. One of our priorities in the upcoming Farm Bill is to increase the cost share to 90% for EQIP projects that address both climate and biodiversity, and also to improve the prioritization under both EQIP and CSP for those kinds of projects.
And if I can offer a thought?
Sure.
I think it's important to recognize that there's lots of different programs out there. And some of them, at least in our view, does make sense to have some, like the income caps on the commodity programs and the caps on that. But the conservation program does not have a limit. So I think there's a difference between the programs that are really focused on helping accelerate on the ground changes towards a more climate-friendly, sustainable, environmentally clean practices, and those that have other purposes. I think it's also important to recognize that a lot of the smaller farms have been affirmatively excluded in the past from participation in these programs. So it's one thing to just keep going in a program that you've been in, but if you've been cut out from a program in the past, as many farmers, particularly farmers of color, women farmers, younger farmers, they don't have the background, they haven't got the system set up. So affirmatively trying to make sure they all have access to these programs that they've been excluded from in the past seems to be really quite important.
So another question's come in asking about water issues, and that their perception is that the environmental community is kind of working against on the opposite side of farmers regarding water use. I know that you talked about partnering on some of these water projects and on efficiency. So the questioner wants to know what are some areas regarding water that perhaps the environmental community and the food and farm community can agree on?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm speaking specifically about some of the water work we've done in California here, but I think across the board it has been making sure we have better data. I mean, more information for growers so they know how much water is being consumed and sort of those credits and debits like I was talking about. But then, I also see a question here about, taking land out of production. And, again, I'm speaking about California and specifically San Joaquin Valley. I mean, there's been a number of studies that demonstrate that there is, sometimes close to 1 million acres that may need to be taken out of production simply because we don't have the water. And that is not EDF saying that, but it is EDF trying to work with farmers to find other solutions. I mean, that is the climate reality that we're in. I would hope that EDF could be a partner in sorting through that. I mean, that is a future that we all face, unfortunately, and we want to use our scientific expertise, our research acumen to help address these problems for the benefit of growers as well as ecosystems. So I mean, I totally understand where the question's coming from, and I think that is a very common perception. EDF as an organization really strives to have uncommon partnerships, and to the extent we can, have bipartisan work, both at the federal level and at the state level. There's not a lot of that at the state level because there's not that many folks across the aisle to work with. But that's really our approach, and it's very focused on sort of pragmatic outcomes. And so I guess I'm maybe not directly answering the question, but I think that's how we're thinking about this, that this is a future that we all face that we have to figure out together, and we want to be a resource to think about that in ways that are good for all stakeholders.
Anyone else want to jump in on the water issue?
I'll just sort of remind everybody that one of the ecosystem services that functioning, healthy, intact ecosystems do provide is storage of water, filtration and improvement of water quality, and to the extent that we can preserve and restore habitats, particularly those aquatic and riparian habitats that contribute so much to our water. I think that's a great idea. Also, just one other sort of water-related thing that I don't think got mentioned is the idea of photovoltaics. So putting solar panels on top of irrigation systems to produce power and also reduce evaporation from those systems, I think, is another area of promise.
And I would just add, there's a real opportunity in perennial agriculture and agroforestry, which with their bigger root mass will generally be more resilient to floods and droughts. And it's not that they necessarily use less water, but they're much more resilient, but often have great climate benefits. And our farm policy is really geared towards annual crops. If you're growing annual or tree crops, California obviously has a big almond and pistachio industry, but in lots of other areas of the country, tree crops are really struggling to get going. And so trying to provide more support for crops that have a different water regime than the annual crops can help be part of the solution. They sometimes can be part of a problem too, so I'm not saying it's a pure solution, but adding support for perennials can be a helpful part of that.
I'll just thank you. I'd just like to throw out one other question. We will have someone from representing the pesticide industry speaking later. Oftentimes, that's a big area of opposition between environmental organizations and those who want to apply crop protection chemicals. I'm just wondering, are there some ways where perhaps, for example, environmental groups could be working to engage on moving towards any kind of common ground on pesticide use, or is that a strong? We have to move to organic and the kinds of pesticides that are allowed only on organic.
Can I jump in on this, because I manage some farms as well as being an advocate, and we shifted how we use pesticides. They're not in this country; they're in Costa Rica, a coffee farm, and we really implemented an aggressive IPM program where we monitor very carefully, put a lot more money into that, and overall reduced our pesticide use over half. And I was really stunned to realize that in the United States, basic integrated pest management is used still on a small portion of farms. And so we think that there's a real opportunity to encourage a different approach to using pesticides that can, maybe you still use some, but you'll use many, many fewer. And New York just passed a law that largely exempts or would ban certain uses of neonics, neonicotinoid pesticides, but there's a waiver provision if the farmer can show he really needs it. And that, in a sense, really pushes and provides some regulatory nudge, as it were, to using a more integrated pest management approach. So I think that can work both ways, because, for example, in our farm, we've saved a ton of money and gotten better pest control once we shifted, but it was we had to get everyone to think differently.
Oh, I just wanted to chime in that, the Community Alliance with Family Farmers, one of my clients is a technical assistance provider helping farmers learn and use less pesticides. So they're kind of on the ground teaching IPM to farmers, and what they found is it's really important that farmers can teach farmers and educate farmers about practices to reduce their pesticide use. But CAF also believes that because of climate change, pest pressures are growing, and that there are some pests that we don't have solutions for right now, and that there needs to be a lot of research for lower risk alternatives to deal with these pesticides, or the pests that are found resistant, or there isn't a pesticide that deals with them. Because part of climate change is that our pests are moving and changing, and that they're causing a real threat. I mean, in California right now, the fruit fly is decimating orange groves, and there's several counties under quarantine right now. So I think the pest problem is real, but we have to be thoughtful on how we deal with it, and CAF is always trying to find middle ground to reduce pesticide usage, but also to ensure that farmers' needs are being met and that they're properly trained and given the tools they need to be successful.
I would agree with all of that, and I will say EDF doesn't do a ton of pesticide work, but where we have sort of dipped our toe in this space comes out of our deep abiding love of data, and so figuring out how we can support growers with precision data, sort of like that groundwater accounting I was talking about. How can you get better data on, from the orchard, from the vineyard, from the field, about what the problem is, where specifically the problem is, so you can get ahead of it fast. So basically using the least amount that you need, which also saves a lot of money. Obviously technology costs money up front, but if you can earn back that return on your investment by using significantly less pesticides, that is, something that is in such the early stages of thinking that there isn't a whole lot to say other than that is something we're interested in.
Well, thank you for all of your comments today, for joining us. Please join me in giving them a round of applause for being here.